Dr. Westermann received his PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is a Regents Professor of History at University San Antonio. He has published extensively in the areas of the Holocaust, genocide, and German military history. He is the author of 4 books and 2 co-edited volumes, including Hitler's Police Battalions Enforcing Racial War in the East from 2005 and Hitler's Osterkrieg and the Indian Wars, Comparing Genocide and Conquest, published in 2016. He was a Fulbright Fellow in Berlin, a 3-time German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD Fellow, USHMM. His recent work, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, appeared with Cornell University Press in association with the USHMM in March of 2021. And with that, I'd like to, one more, please make sure that your audio and video are disabled. During the session, again, you could submit any questions needed or comments in the chat box. Your questions, comments may be public to everyone or sent private to the hosts. Again, that's myself and Christiane. And once the session is completed, a staff member will share questions with Dr. Westermann during the Q&A session. And with that note, I introduce Dr. Westermann. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for being here. Let me go ahead and share my screen now. Hopefully it's up and everyone can see it. Before I get started, though, I would like to at least mention in the past year, we've lost from the San Antonio community 2 of our Holocaust survivors. So George Fodor and Anna Beto both have passed, and they were key members in testifying about their experience in the Holocaust, and very key members of the local community. So I wanted just to take a brief moment to remember their contributions and remember their memory. As you see today, I'm going to be talking about something that a subject that many of you may not really know about, the fact that the German army had a military mail system. And as you can see from the opening photos that I have here provided, this was a system that allowed individuals to send packages up to about 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds home to their family members, and also what we would consider to be regular mail. And I want to talk about today how that system worked and what we can learn as a result of thinking about that system. So, there we go. And I have really 2 questions that I want to focus on today that I think are kind of the bigger issues for us to think about. What do we find out? In other words, what were German soldiers, German SS and policemen, what types of information were they sharing with their loved ones back on the home front is one of those key questions. And then a second question that's related to that is, what do these sources reveal about German public knowledge of atrocities in the Holocaust? So these are the 2 issues that we'll be returning to as I talk about these sources. Now, one of the things that may surprise people who are watching this is that the German military mail system handled a total of about 40 billion letters and items over the course of World War II. So these were about 10 billion of these letters and packages were sent by troops home to their family members, and about 30 billion letters were sent then from home to those family members. So that number obviously gives you an idea of the scale and scope of the amount of information that was being traded between the occupied territories and the home front. And as we look at this, it was in one respect, not only information, but an important factor was also that troops in these occupied areas could send things home, these packages of about 2 pounds, that often included things like butter, even eggs, alcohol, things that were harder to get in Germany proper, that these troops had taken or purchased in the occupied territories that they would then share back with their family members. and also some pretty horrific types of goods that are found in some of these packages, to include things like gold teeth, to include things like the plundered cash and jewelry of those killed during the Holocaust. So I'll return to some of that discussion as we move forward. And one of the things that's important to note is that it was prohibited to share information on things like your unit, its location, its operations, and especially things like mass atrocity. However, if you think about 10 billion letters and in a very small number of censors, what will be apparently obvious is that most of the letters are never going to be censored. And in fact, what we find is that we have a number of these sources because they were uncensored, because they got through the censor gate and made it back to Germany proper. And I'll give you some examples of these types of letters. And in fact, that we see that discussions of atrocity and mass killing are widely shared in some of these letters. Now, I want to start with just a general idea here, because a myth has kind of, if you will, grown up around the Holocaust, that it was really a secret, that most people were unaware of it, that Germans didn't know what's happening in the East, that they don't know, they don't have access to this type of information. And I want to start with looking at, this is an order before the invasion of the Soviet Union that Adolf Hitler gives to his commanders. And one of the things that you'll see, the reason that I highlight this is because he's talking about the war against the Soviet Union as a war of annihilation. And he's telling his commanders that they have to essentially put aside their scruples in this battle. Now, this order is given to thousands of military commanders. So this is something that they know even before German forces crossed the frontier into the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941. And for those not familiar with the campaign in the East, the area in which the Holocaust, for the most part, the greatest number of victims are going to be from. This is an initial map showing the German penetration, the German army's penetration into the Soviet Union and into the Baltic states. And I point that out because I have another map here. And this map may be less familiar to some of you. This is actually the Pell of Settlement. This is where Catherine the Great in the mid-18th century sent Russian Jewish populations to live. So they were moved out of areas like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And anybody here who may be familiar with Fiddler on the Roof, for example, it's you see at the end of the movie how the family is having to leave their farm. They're having to move further to the west. Well, the reason that this is important, if we juxtapose these two maps together and we overlay them, what you will immediately see is that in the initial months of the German operations into the Soviet Union, it takes exactly those areas that are most densely populated by East European Jews. And another thing to remember is that already in 1939, almost 3 million Polish Jews have become under German occupation as well. So when we talk about what it is, where does the Holocaust happen, or where is the major focus of European Jewry in this period, it's going to be in Eastern Europe. So looking at this campaign into Eastern Europe and into the Soviet Union, I'm going to give you, again, some more background for you to understand the information that's available, at least to the fighting troops and the SS and policemen. And in the case of Directive 21, which you see on the top of the slide here, Wilhelm Keitel is the head of the German military. He's the head of the German general staff, the Wehrmacht staff. And here he is telling his troops and his commanders as they are going about to embark on this campaign that the SS has special tasks. And he's telling the troop commanders that those special tasks are only the concern of the SS and the police. And the term special task is essentially a euphemism for annihilation, for the murder of European Jews in those areas, for the murder of Bolshevik commissars or communist commissars as well. And so this is a widely distributed order amongst the troops. The second order that you see is an order that's given down to the basic troop level. In other words, this would go down to the lowest individual unit level. And what it essentially says is that German military troops, not SS or policemen, operating in these areas during the invasion can, at their own discretion, finish off quote unquote guerrillas, and that's defined by the unit itself. They can also execute civilians accused of crimes without having to bring them to a court, and that an officer, meaning even a lieutenant in these units, can authorize these types of action. What it also does is it allows the individual officers at the unit level to decide whether the troops themselves, if they are involved in so-called excesses, to include things like sexual assaults, sexual violence in the East, wanton murder, that it allows the officer in that unit to decide whether the individual should be brought up for charges or the actual action should be ignored. Now, I bring this up because there are 3 million troops that are going to enter the Soviet Union in this period from Germany and their allies, about 3.5 million, in fact. So what we already see is the nature of the campaign is very clear to those millions of troops who are involved. And I have two other orders that precede this campaign. And again, these guidelines for the troops talk about who the enemies are. And this idea of ruthless and energetic action against communists, saboteurs, and if you'll note, again, Jews as a category that are brought out. And the discussion of the total elimination of all active and passive resistance. And I think this is an important point. So we're not talking about eliminating people who are actively taking up arms against the German invasion. Those who exhibit so-called passive resistance can also be eliminated. So in other words, it's really a blank check. And finally, what we see is the so-called Commissar Order, which is quite infamous in the historiography, says that Jewish Bolshevist commissars, as defined by the Nazis, are to be immediately executed. And we see again that they tie this to, quote, Asiatic fighting methods. So we see that not only the anti-Semitism that is being inculcated into these orders, but also the racial aspects of these orders and the ideological aspects are also in these orders. And this is an order from Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, who's the head of the 6th Army. And to give you an idea, he's in command of about 300,000 troops. And in October of 1941, he is going to issue this order on his own initiative to his troops. And as you can see from the couple of areas that I've underlined, he talks about the necessity of a severe but just revenge on subhuman Jewry. So this is a military commander telling about 300,000 of his troops that this is the type of campaign they're waging. And if you look at this order, it becomes very clear that he himself is parroting Nazi propaganda in this. And the fact that it reaches almost 300,000 men is important. But Hitler likes this order so much that he tells the Wehrmacht General Staff that they need to send a copy of this order to every unit fighting in the East. Now, the reason I added this is because, in fact, what we see, independent of what soldiers are writing, what soldiers themselves know about the nature of the campaign that they've been initiated. And so now I want to go ahead and look at some of the letters. And this comes from my newest book. I talk about Westermann, who is a Viennese policeman, and he's writing home to his wife. And it's the 2nd of October. And what Westermann knows that day as he's riding home to his wife is that he's been issued extra ammunition. And he knows that he's going to be involved in a mass atrocity, in a mass killing action. And he's telling his wife that the 28 bullets that he got for his pistol, he's not sure that's going to be enough for this killing action as he understands it. And then he adds, by the time I get home, I will have some pretty things to tell you. So again, we're getting an insight into what he thinks he is going to be involved in or knows that he's going to be involved in and how he feels about that. Now, 3 days later, he writes to his wife to tell her what actually happened in that action. And in it, in his letter, that letter 3 days later, he tells her at first his hands were shaking. So he was nervous, he said. But then he notes by the time the 10th group of victims arrived, he, quote, I calmly and surely shocked at the many women, children, and infants. He then admits to participating in a game with his fellow policemen that involved the throwing of infants over the graveside and shooting them out of the air. And he ends that discussion by telling his wife, now I understand the meaning of the word bloodlust or Blutrausch in German in this case. And so here in this one letter, it's very clear that he lets his wife, the most intimate partner he has, know about exactly what he's involved in. And it's also clear that he acclimates himself to the necessity in his mind of participating in these actions very quickly. Now, another SS man, in this case, a member of the Einsatzgruppen. And the Einsatzgruppen were these killing units that went forward into the occupied territories in the East, and they were purpose-built for mass murder. In fact, normally groups of about 30 men, they would enter small villages, shtetls, and they would annihilate, murder the entire Jewish population of those tiny villages over sometimes a day, 2 days, over the course of the week. And the photo that you see at the bottom is of a depiction of exactly that up close and horrific killing that takes place. The photo underneath to the right is those dots all represent communities in which the Einsatzgruppen traveled to these communities and where they conducted mass atrocity. But this is from an SS man, KARL KRETSCHMER, and he's writing home in September of 1942. So I've excerpted his letter. And he tells his wife, my dear Zoska, he said, you'll be impatient because you have received no letter from me since Monday, September 1942. Now, I want to point out here that this is 6 days earlier is when he's written his previous letter. And he considers actually a week without writing to be quite long. I think that's important. When we think about the billions of letters that are traveling back and forth, this gives you an idea of the type of close communication that's taking place. And he tells her that he hasn't been able to write sooner. And he then goes on to describe the sight of the dead, including women and children, is not very cheering. As the war, in our opinion, is a Jewish war, he talks about the Jews are first to feel it. Here in Russia, wherever the German soldier is, no Jew remains. You can imagine that at first I needed some time to come to grips with this. So once again, we have a letter to an intimate partner from an individual who's involved in mass murder and mass atrocity, in which he's speaking quite openly to his wife about what he's involved in. In a letter then, a later letter, as you can see from the salutation, he's now writing not only to his wife, but he's including his children in this letter. And he tells them some of what he's been doing over that past month. We spend the evenings either playing cards, boozing, or sitting together with the boss. I have already told you about the shooting, that I could not say no either. That's the way people are judged here. but you can trust your daddy. And I think this is very important. So he's talking about mass murder. He's already told his wife he's involved in that, but now he's speaking directly to his children as well. He tells him he thinks about them all the time and is not shooting immoderately. And then he talks about a neighbor that he knows who has been sent to France. And he talks about Herr Kern, this neighbor, as probably would not have been tough enough like he is for these duties in the East. And then he mentions people soon get used to the sight of blood. And he ends this passage with a joke by saying what people might get used to the sight of blood, what the men don't like to see at the end of the day for dinner is blood sausage. And so again, the type of wording, the type of linguistic constructions that we're seeing here, not only is he admitting to being involved in these types of killings, he's addressing it to his wife and to his children, but he's also then even making a joke as he's talking about these activities. And for the final letter of KRETSCHMER's that I would use here, he is again now speaking to his wife, and he calls her, in this case, dear mother, is what he is saying, and again, dear children. And he's talking about his duties. And now he talks about also what I spoke of earlier, the fact that he's able to send parcels. And what he's concerned with in this case is that the parcels that he's sending, these 10 parcels that have been sent, that the family doesn't show them around too much. And what I can tell you from experience and from reading some of the court cases related to perpetrators, in these parcels, it's not only sending fruit or butter or even eggs, as I talked about earlier, back to your families. It's also about sending the money, the jewelry, the things confiscated from those who are being killed, which itself is prohibited, but is done widely during this period. So these men are taking advantage of their positions to confiscate the goods of those that they've murdered. And finally, he ends this discussion with his faith in the Fuhrer, or Adolf Hitler, as giving them strength to carry on this difficult and thankless task, because he knows that what he is doing is necessary. And I would highlight that, again, when we think about these individuals who are involved, it's very difficult sometimes to understand what their motivations are or their ideology. But in these kinds of shared letters, what it allows us to do is to get an insight into what they're telling their most intimate partners or family members about why they're involved in this. And so certainly this idea of a true believer comes through in KRETSCHMER's letter. And in another letter back to a wife, this is from a sergeant in the German military, Konrad Jarosch. He is an administrator of a Soviet prisoner of war camp. And he's writing back to his wife. He has a whole series of letters that he shares with his family and his wife. And the one that I'm excerpting here is he talks about the world is so barren without God here and on the other side of the front. And one thing you would need to know about Konrad Jarosch, before he entered the military, he was a Protestant theologian, a man of faith who's mobilized into the military. And he continues that letter by saying, yet another one of our prisoners lie dying. Such deaths occur by millions. This is truly the work of the devil. Now, in this case, what we see is a man sharing not only his personal feelings about the nature of this war in the East, but another aspect of the Holocaust. We think about the 6 million European Jews who are killed, but over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war will perish in German custody as well. In fact, in the first 8 months of the attack on the Soviet Union, from June of 1941 to February of 1942, 2 million Soviet prisoners of war will die in German custody. And I showed those photographs here on the bottom. If you look at the one on the left, it may be difficult to see, but in the left-hand bottom corner, that's a German military guard. He's got his foot resting on a chair, and he has his weapon. And as you look at that picture, what you probably noticed, it looks like a giant ravine feature. And if you can look closer, what you'll see is these are tens of thousands of individuals. These are Soviet prisoners of war. In fact, during the initial months of the German invasion, as I mentioned, millions are taken into captivity. And what the Germans would do is they would first use a terrain feature like this ravine. The first thing that they would build around that ravine would be a wire fence, a barbed wire fence to enclose those prisoners. And then over time, if the materials were available, they would start to build maybe kitchens for cooking, barracks. In many cases, the prisoners would live in that field and would dig into the ground. And I ask you to think about what starts to happen as you have hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of prisoners living in a field with little to eat. That serves as no sanitary facilities. So what immediately becomes apparent is those areas become swamps and bogs with cholera and typhus, and thousands in some cases, and as Konrad Jarosz talks about, millions can die in those conditions. And what we see on the picture at the right is that those who survive into the end of the war, those Soviet prisoners of war who make it as forced laborers into Germany or into the concentration camps, when Germany needs laborers, this is the condition that they leave those camps in. And many of them do not survive those camps either. So we see a clear connection to the fate of the European Jews and the fate of Soviet prisoners of war. And again, in Jarosz's book that actually was edited by his son, who never met his dad, and his son, also named Konrad Jarosz, is a very famous historian and someone who actually taught me at the University of North Carolina. In the book, Reluctant Accomplice, Jarosz writes in one of his letters a line that struck me. It often froze us to our very souls, the actions that they were involved in. Now, I have another source that I'd like us to consider as well. And this is from a German bureaucrat. His name is Friedrich Kellner, and he keeps a diary. And in the diary for 29 July 1941, this is about a month after the Germans have invaded the Soviet Union, he talks about visiting a hospital. And he says, wounded soldiers in the field hospital in Gießen are saying Russian prisoners of war are being killed. And he writes that with an exclamation mark. So a mere month into the actual invasion of the Soviet Union, a minor German bureaucrat in a town in central Germany also now has access to acts of mass atrocity. And if we look further at some of these sources, here I have a letter from a lieutenant to his wife. And this lieutenant is in the East. He's in the occupied Soviet Union. And it's now 29 January 1943. And he's writing to his wife as an officer, he's in charge. So an old Slavic man has come to him to complain. He's come to him to complain about German military men taking away his pig. And now he wants reimbursement for it. And as you see, Lieutenant Hans Rahed essentially tells his wife, in any case, the animal is gone. And he admits, of course, it was for our kitchen. He says it's hard on those who are affected by having to lose these items, but that's the nature of the war. And that last line, with that, the case is closed. And I ask you to think about this. This is winter in the Soviet Union in 1943. And as the war progresses, what happens is German logistics and supplies to the front become very difficult for Germany to supply the millions of troops in the East. So what do those troops do throughout the war? They take not only the chickens and the pigs and the cows from the local farmers, they take their seed corn, they take their grain, they take their honey, and in many cases, when they move into a small town in winter, they'll go into the local houses and they'll throw the inhabitants out into the cold and take possession of those areas as well. And in fact, what we know is that millions of normal Soviet non-Jewish citizens will also perish from starvation and the elements during this campaign in the East. And so when we start to think about how 30 million Soviet military and civilians, including Soviet Jews, perish, we start to get an idea how the nature of this war is fought. But we also see that these men are sharing that information with their family members at home. Here's another case of a German soldier. I kind of, when I show this to my students in class, I call him the German Harry Potter because he really kind of has that look. This is Willy Peter Reese, and Reese is just a normal enlisted soldier. And he loves to read. He would rather read Pushkin than he would read tactical journals. But after he's sent to the East, he decides to journal his experiences. And here in this journal entry, we see how this individual who before the war was an intellectual who's not interested in the military himself becomes entangled and involved with the criminality of the German army in the East. And again, I'm not talking about the SS and the police. I'm talking about the German military and how he himself writes about this. Now, his journal is a private journal, just like a diary would be private, but it's later published. And what we find is he perishes in Russia in 1944. And what's powerful about this journal is that when it's published, it's what his thoughts were at the time. In other words, the journal is not 10 years or 20 years after the war re-edited. This is what he thought. This is what he experienced. And I think that's important to talk about. And here I have another case. This is of an SS doctor who's stationed at Auschwitz and Birkenau at the killing center and labor camp at Birkenau. And he's there on a deployment, about a 6-month deployment. And in his diary, which each diary entry, if you look at the total diary, is only about a paragraph at most long. And on 23 September 1942, he's talking about that he's just participated that evening in his 6th and 7th, what he calls Sonderaktionen, special actions, i.e. mass killings. In other words, that night, he has been involved in the mass murder of over 3,000 individuals. He's seen them die. And one thing you would have to know is that the SS required a doctor to be at the gas chambers during the process of annihilation. And so he talks about getting done with these mass killings, and they have a general officer from the SS who's visiting. And the general officer, because the general officer's visiting, he talks about at the officer's mess or the officer's restaurant, there's a real feast, talks about baked pike as much as you wanted, real ground coffee, excellent beer, and open-faced sandwiches. Now, I ask you to think about this. The juxtaposition in a diary entry about the mass murder of thousands with about how delicious his meal was that evening gives you an idea, certainly, of what he's thinking about. And if we move forward in his diary, he has another entry where he also talks about now he's up to his 12th and 13th gassings. And then he mentions that that evening after those gassings, it ends in an evening cozy get-together in the officers club with Bulgarian red wine and Croatian plum brandy. Again, we see the juxtaposition of mass murder with a perpetrator who's talking about how pleasant his evening was at the end of the day. Now, another source that is not as widely known was when the Allies captured German prisoners of war in many of the areas where they were kept, especially for senior officers. They were kept in areas that the British and the Americans, they bugged their rooms. They bugged the common areas. So they were taping what these prisoners were saying without the prisoners knowing about it. So I have one excerpt here. This is a German POW, a prisoner of war. His name is Aue, and he's talking to another prisoner of war, a guy by the name of Schneider. And he's telling him, perhaps we didn't always do right in killing Jews in masses in the East. And his friend Schneider says, yep, it was undoubtedly a mistake. We could have done that later. And then Aue comes back and says, after we had finally established ourselves. Schneider then responds, we should have put it off until later because Jews are and will always remain influential people, especially in America. Now, I ask you to note that this was actually recorded in July of 1944. Now, they don't know at the time that the end of the war is going to be less than a year away in Europe, but they do know at the time that Germany is going to lose this war. And what we see here is that the average German soldiers are very comfortable talking about the genocide of European Jews and saying, well, you know, the only thing we should have done is not done it so early. We should have put it off until we were certain that we were going to win. And then you see again that Schneider is very comfortable again using Nazi propaganda about Jews controlling the America and the American government, a trope that is also used in Nazi propaganda about Great Britain. So once again, the widespread nature and discussion of this information is clearly there. And I want to return now to the diary of Friedrich Kellner, who I told you was that German bureaucrat. And I've put a star where his town is that he's living in. This is in central Germany. It's a village, actually, of less than 10,000 people at the time. So he's a minor bureaucrat out in the sticks. And I wouldn't use Pleasanton as an example here, but some of us may be familiar with Pleasanton. I like Pleasanton, but it's the similar kind of thing. A local official, let's say, in Pleasanton. And what's he writing in his diary in 15 December of 1941? He's talking about how Nazis are very proud of their animal protection laws. And then he transitions to talking about the suffering they caused the Jews, with Jews treated even worse than animals. And he says this cruel, despicable, and sadistic treatment against the Jews has lasted now for several years, with its final goal of extermination is the biggest stain on the honor of Germany. And why I think this is important is a minor German official who's hundreds of miles away from Berlin in the seat of government, who's thousands of miles away from the front. What is he able to know? What information is he able to gain just based on listening and watching what's going on around him? And if he's able to get this information, what it also tells us is that those who want to have this information in Germany itself are able to get it. And I've got two sources I want to end with, and then I'll wrap up and take some questions. Another thing that we need to remember is it's often stated by Holocaust deniers, well, there is no written order that Hitler signed. We don't have a written order that he signed authorizing the Holocaust, but we do have his public speeches. And as you see, this is an excerpt from a public speech on 30 January 1942. And 30 January is a very important date in the Nazi calendar because in 30 January 1933 is when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. And so this is his annual State of the Union address to the German people. And as you see, he's speaking in the largest public venue available in Berlin. And his speech is also being broadcast throughout Germany. And what does he say as part of this speech? This war will not end as the Jews imagine, namely in the liquidation of all the European and Aryan peoples. The outcome of this war will be the extermination of Jewry. So this information is literally available to any German who is listening to that radio broadcast at that time. And Hitler is quite openly speaking about plans of extermination and annihilation. And the final source that I want to end with before I wrap up is the US military has intelligence units that as Germany, as the front is being pushed back into Germany, they're following the troops into these now occupied German cities. And in Western Germany, Aachen, which is the imperial seat, Karl the Great, for example, the empire of Karl Charlemagne was in Aachen. As an army officer, intelligence officer, SAPL, is entering Aachen, he is interrogating German civilians. Now, Aachen is a German city in the far west of Germany, as far away in Germany as you could get from the Eastern Front. And what he writes about in the book that he publishes in 1946, from these interviews that he's doing in October of 1944, is how many people that he meets willingly talk about the fact that they know about atrocities that are being committed in the East. And in this case, I've quoted an excerpt from his interview with a former German communist, RETIREE, who tells him every German knew of the atrocities committed against Jews, Poles, and Czechs, and they now blame the Fuhrer alone. Our people have no courage. Nazi propaganda and filth have systematically undermined the moral fiber of the German nation. So this is a German telling an American in October 1944 that in the most Western city, if you will, away from the Eastern Front, there is widespread knowledge of the types of activities that are taking place, including mass atrocities and mass killing. So the final insights that I would share to kind of wrap up this conversation is that these ideas, these killings, this mass atrocity is widely known in Germany. German soldiers trade stories about the killings in the East and in incarceration when they're taken prisoner, that these German propaganda elements widely disseminate Hitler speeches and also public references about the annihilation of the European Jews, and that in fact, this knowledge is widely available on the German home front. Now, one of the issues and the final point here that is really important to point out is with the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946 and the subsequent trials that take place in Nuremberg, a myth develops propagated amongst the German public and by Germans in positions of political power, that the Holocaust was a secret. Even Hermann Göring, who is going to be convicted and escapes the noose hanging by taking the cyanide pill at Nuremberg, says, I didn't know what was going on. So it was the SS that knew it, I didn't know it. And what we see is that in this case, this myth actually endures, even though it's widely discounted once you start to look at the many sources that are available to show German knowledge. So censorship, to wrap up, certainly does not disguise, in this case, what happens in the Holocaust. So I look forward to, I think we have about 15 minutes, so I look forward to any questions you might have. And I again appreciate those who showed up for today's talk.